Good afternoon. My name is Susan. I'm chairing your session this afternoon. We've got 3 papers today that we learned last night. So we might wrap up a little bit earlier at around 4:30 unless we have a thriving discussion. So I'm going to welcome our first 2 presenters together. We have Aiden, Aylett, Toija, Cinque, and Jodi, McAlister from Deakin, who are going to be presenting their paper on digital dissonance, the outright masculinity, and the strategy of information operations.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Toija Cinque, and I lead a research group called Critical Digital Infrastructures and Interfaces. And with this that I'm doing large language models and capacity to debias content in a way to get past some of the narratives that affect various communities at the moment, looking at wider communities, but also looking at those from the LGBTQI communities and what the language learning models might afford. And our paper today is looking at a particular case study, and we're looking at the alt-right movement, and we are looking at a number of videos. And just a disclaimer that some of the content can be confronting. It is quite awkward for us to go through, but nonetheless, I think that Aiden's going to overview our project.
In the meantime, too, I'm Aiden Aylett. I am a PhD student here at Deakin. I focus on studying communities that are doing collaborative writing practices online, and looking at communities and collaboration in terms of communication is kind of my field, so that's how I came into this chapter here. So yes, our chapter is on digital dissonance, the alt-right masculinity, and the strategy of information operations within that community. And just the next slide there. So to kind of start with, we had to really work on defining that community because the term alt-right is used quite broadly. The community is a decentralized combination of kind of multiple political groups that have come under this one umbrella term. And Thomas Mean has actually discussed these 5 pillars of their community, which work around an idea that liberal democracy is fundamentally flawed and that all men aren't created equal. This community is structured around ideas of white supremacy and has a fundamental kind of disbelief in things like feminist ideology and other ideologies based around the idea of equalities between different types of people. We also had to kind of specify the difference between the alt-right and the alt-light. The alt-light is very similar ideologically, but stops short of pushing for racial separatism. So the next slide. So the alt-right positions themselves as defenders of a hegemony of masculinity which is under threat, whether that's from feminists, whether that is from various kinds of ideologies that might be a corrupting influence to this kind of masculinity that they believe in. And as such, the alt-right fundamentally at its core is anti-feminist and misogynistic. The next slide. So we look at the alt-right through the model of Stephen Hassan's Bite model of authoritarian control in this chapter. Scholars like Hoffman and Hassan categorize cults, and particularly dangerous cults. So these cults might be based on a religious, political, psychotherapeutic, ideological, financial, or even based around a personality of one person. So when we're looking at the alt-right, we're looking particularly at their communication methods and the language that they use. Now, each of these types of cults uses these methods of authoritarian control. They use behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. The next slide. So when we look at the alt-right and its particular examples of behavioral control, we can see things like them talking about who people should and shouldn't be spending time with. We see things like targeted harassment campaigns against those who disagree, particularly in the instance of early campaigns like Gamergate. We can also see things like rewards and punishments to regulate the behavior of people within the movement. And in the next slide, so in terms of information control, I feel like we have all heard the term fake news. There is a very wide distrust of media outlets, of news sources, of anyone presenting a kind of information that does not line up with the ideology that the alt-right is deeming permissible. We see the kind of insider and outsider mentality compartmentalizing what it is and isn't okay to believe. The next slide. So in terms of thought control, it kind of leads on from the information control. We see that group doctrine then being internalized. The responses to criticism, for example, particularly in the case of podcasts that are being clipped and shared around to a wider audience, we see the criticism being that they're taken out of context and that if someone just watches the whole thing, they will understand. So there's this kind of denial and rationalization when it comes to ideological criticism. There is the belief that alternate beliefs are illegitimate or evil or not useful to the cause, and so that they are discouraged from people having them. And on the next slide, we have emotional control. So in terms of emotional control, we see the alt-right using highly charged language. We see, for example, Alex Jones uses political rhetoric and religious faith to kind of combine his various ideological views into a message that calls on people's faith, calls on their pre-existing emotional connection to these ideas. We also see, for example, in some of Andrew Tate's work, he's talking about himself as a man of light in a world of shadow. So there are these metaphorical uses of language and these various techniques used to inspire emotion in the people listening, to give them that connection to the group so that they will trust the people speaking, so that they will align their ideologies. And on our next slide. So we chose to look at podcasts, both ones which are audio only and ones which have video, so that we could talk about how the medium kind of allows this message to be distributed as it is. And Toija.
We wanted to have a mixed method approach to look at not just the text, but what else was going on, and in a way it's a multi-modal analysis. So the prime focus is the text analysis, and we'll speak about that method, but we were conscious that there were visual elements that were being portrayed, object communication in terms of the objects that certain influencers that subscribe to some of these podcasts and the hosts will have ideas of affluence, their clothing. So we have a theory on which audiences might be attracted to these podcasts. So we're going to unpack the videos looking at key visual communication elements in that, as well as audio as well. Next slide, please. So Jodi, who's not able to be with us today, is taking us through the intimate sound of the podcast. So not just the visual elements, the text will come to in a moment, but also the audio elements as well. She's taking it through the lens of intimate audio, and that having someone's voice whispered intimately into your ear can have a profound effect on those that are listening to the content from the hosts of these podcasts. In terms of our method, next slide, please. So in terms of our method, we have taken, we've chosen 5 podcasts. We've got transcripts for these. In terms of our ethics, we will put this through ethics clearance, but these are all publicly available podcasts. And we are looking at the text, and we put them through a tool called Buoyant. It's an organisation, it's not a company tool, and it offers the capacity to get data analytics from it. So with the large body of text, we are mapping that to the BITE model, so across behaviour, across information, for example, and we're looking at what the host says and what aspect of the BITE model the text falls into. So we will find comments such as, you know, people should, you know, follow our norm. I am the light, as Aiden pointed to, some quite surprising ideas that apparently us women need the men to pay for us when we go out for dinner. Quite surprising to me. So there are a number of things that we find confronting, but interesting in terms of how they map to the BITE model. By means there is one other study that has looked similarly at the BITE model, but it hasn't been applied in the same way across our mixed methods approach. So as well as being able to map to the BITE model, our Buoyant data analytics will give us frequencies, tables of counts, so the number of times that particular words are to help us to code for the keywords that we are looking for.
And on to the next slide, please. So we expect to find a pretty wide range of behaviours associated with the BITE model within this. We don't necessarily expect it to align perfectly because we are not looking at this as one separate organization as a whole. This is a lot of different, sometimes conflicting ideological groups aligned under one kind of umbrella group. But what we do expect to find is the use of authoritarian language, the use of manipulative language, and the use of calls to action that dictate the way people who interact with this content are kind of permitted to view, interact with, and think about the world. And the next slide. So as we've been looking so far, we have looked at, closely looked at 5 episodes, 3 from the Andrew Tate Watch podcast, because they are quite short in comparison to the other 2 podcasts. We've looked at one of the longer Ben Shapiro Show podcasts, and closely looked at the Alex Jones Show, one of his episodes too. Now, what we have found is that each of these has a very different approach in terms of visuals or sound design. So Andrew Tate's has some interesting visuals that really curate envy in terms of affluence, in terms of success with women. With Ben Shapiro, we found this curated appearance of almost academic authority. And with the Alex Jones Show, while there were no visuals, we did find that there were sound bites used, like a news show introduction song. And these were there to kind of give you that sense of, this is a valid news show. This is somewhere you can get safe information. Each of these podcasts so far has used various kinds of in-group and out-group rhetoric. Each of them treats masculinity as being under attack, something that must be both protected from these attacks, but something that must also attack in turn. And each of them uses various kinds of persuasive language and tactics, like speaking incredibly quickly while using difficult to kind of untangle language to keep people constantly in this loop of trying to understand what's being said. Certain language that normalizes some behaviors while critiquing social norms. So each of these episodes has used language, audio, and video to create this sense of almost urgency and this sense that they are the ones in the right, that anyone who disbelieves them must be in the wrong and is therefore the enemy. And in that sense, this chapter is going to hopefully, when it is all done, give us a sense of how the alt-right both recruits new people and how they keep those people involved with a sense of political urgency and importance. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you both want to, are you happy to stay up there just for the camera? Do you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. I'd like to give word to Lydia, who is acting as one of the discussants. Are you happy to comment first?
Sure, yeah, thank you. It's okay if I comment from here?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for the draft chapter. I think it's a fascinating topic to study, and really congratulate you on looking into that. And I particularly like that about the data set that you're using, where you're looking at audio content, because so much of this is often a textual analysis or mimetic analysis. So I think this offers us a really useful kind of counterpoint to some of those other data streams and stuff. So using audio data is I think is really terrific. Just a couple of things that kind of came to mind just for your consideration through the presentation. So when you were first talking about definitions of the alt-right, I think one of the things also to consider is that it's very much an online phenomenon. And so highlighting the online nature of its kind of development, its emergence, its continuation, because so much of the alt-right kind of came up with online culture as well. It's almost like online and alt-right culture are pretty much inseparable in a certain sense. So I think that might be something useful to also highlight in the chapters. Also the podcast that you were saying that you were looking at, so it's Tate, Alex Jones, Ben Shapiro. I'm not sure if I would necessarily put them under the definition of alt-right. So I think because they kind of sit adjacent but outside of that. So it'd be really, I think, useful and interesting to see how either they sit side by side, how they intersect, because they don't really fit under that a technical definition of alt-right in terms of sharing supremacist ideas, at least overtly, right? But there is certainly an intersection there to be explored. And with the manosphere, in terms of the other things to take a look at in terms of defining and conceptualizing it, an interesting thing that I've found with the manosphere, with doing some other research that I've done with that, is its intersection with spirituality and religion. And so their intersection with traditionalism and religious orthodoxy, I think, could be a useful way to kind of flesh out what the manosphere is. In terms of using the BITE model and kind of this things, kind of concepts from the cult literature, I think is really, really interesting, really useful. But if I would also recommend too, particularly if you're saying that the goal of the study is focusing on how these movements recruit and how they keep them politically engaged. Other bodies of literature that you might consider taking a look at was engaging with social movement theory and social movement literature, and also engaging with kind of the radicalization and extremism literature coming out of terrorism studies as well, because there's been a lot written on the alt-right and the manosphere within those, within particularly the terrorism and extremism literature that you might find useful. There might be some concepts and frameworks that you can bring into that. And then I would also put the suggestion of trying to maybe tease out or understand control versus influence. And if you see a difference in that, it might mess with kind of the BITE model a bit, but might be something for you to consider. And when you spoke about some of the control aspects and the mechanisms that they're using, so one of the things I clocked that you mentioned is this kind of dulling of critical thinking skills. But you might find, I think you will find as you listen on to them, there's also an appeal to critical thinking as well in some of the discourse that the alt-right and the manosphere engage in. So that's kind of an interesting kind of contradiction that would be kind of useful to see. And the last thing I would kind of point to is in your coding, when you're talking about identifying authoritarian language, manipulative language, I'm sure that you will do this in your chapter and stuff. It would be really useful to know how you code it, how you define it in there. But congratulations on a great presentation and a great area of study. Thank you.
That's all really
Great,
helpful.
great feedback.
Thanks, Lydia. Might just move to Robert here online for your comments. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting, and I swear I haven't been talking to the other respondent, but some of the things that I'm going to pick up on will probably be quite similar. I kind of, one, like, it's a great idea. I like it. I've written on it before in a other tangential way, but I just wonder if it overlooks the sort of other controlling masculinities that are out there. Andrew Tate represents a particular style of controlling masculinity, based on the domination of women, but like the incel community, which overlaps a lot with the kind of things that you're talking about, takes another way and takes another view of controlling women in a more passive aggressive way, I guess, right, of adopting that kind of thing. And it, like, this might be again a little bit off topic, but it does tend to overlook the sort of counterpoint movement, alternative point movement of the feminists perspective on these kind of things, with the manosphere of like this reactive to trad wife kind of things, where there are complementary arguments being made by women or so-called feminists that do conform to the kind of ideas that are being portrayed by both incels and the Andrew Tates of the world, that sort of toxic masculinity. So I wonder again, that point, is this really the alt-right, or is this the manosphere that we're talking about in some respects? I know there are close adjacencies with the alt-right and with the manosphere, especially around the ideas of tradition and eroding of traditional so-called traditional values, whichever traditional values they happen to ascribe to, which usually be Western centric, and I guess a bit more on the methodology. It's an interesting methodology. I like the idea of the soundscape of the articles being useful for interpreting it, and useful for framing the language that comes from them, and useful for highlighting certain pieces and setting the tone. I would just be wary of projecting meaning onto the bags of words that you're going to get out of Voyant. Like there are these words, like some of the work that I do is definitely natural language processing kind of type things, and you end up with these bags of words, right, which you kind of end up having to ascribe meaning to. And you do need to be careful of like not projecting, you've got some ideas about what you'll find. You got to be careful of projecting those ideas onto the bags of words, right? What are these bags of words that you've got? What are these frequent terms? What are these frequent phrases? How do we code those things? And I think, like, as has been pointed out, you do need to be quite rigorous in finding a code way of coding those things, and looking at those edge cases. You've got to be wary of not cherry picking things as well. Like, like, this word is definitely in this column, or this word's definitely in this column. I think, there is, you've got to be ready for chaos when you've got to be ready for ambiguity in the language that you'll find. Especially, I guess, Five's a lot of podcasts, but it's not a heap of podcast, like not heaps of podcasts either. So you do need to be a bit careful of like the information that's contained in those is a subsection, not the whole thing. I'm sure I'm explaining that, preaching to the choir here. Yeah, and that's basically it, right? Just explain the process of the analysis first, about how you're assigning those bags of words, and like being very clear around those things. But other than that, yeah, this is a great idea. I love it.
Just following up, we're not doing any testing to look for correlations or whether or not there are relationships between the words, but we will have a line for the codes that we do choose. And just to reassure our editors, we are working through work by Michelle Grossman and the network in terms of how we look at, building digital literacies, I suppose, around radicalisation, etc., etc. Really good point. Thank you for that. And all the other good points, actually. We definitely have on the radar, and we'll be unpacking what links there are with manosphere and, I guess, spirituality, naturalism, potentially. That's something that Aiden can speak to very well, and alluded to, so that's really good to make sure that comes through really clearly. Yes, it would be really tricky semantic debate, what's control, what's influence. interviewing choice views, manufacturing consent. You know, at what point does it stop being, you know, a little subtle nudge to influence to all our control, and that'll be something that, you know, can help us to extrapolate it through, thinking that through. Thank you for it. Thanks for your time.
Just very quickly too, just mentioning resources and stuff. I'm sure you've come across this work, obviously, but a colleague of ours, Dr. Josh Roos, obviously does a lot of work on this area as well. So his work is a great resource.
Very much.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you. Toija.